Steve's mental conversations were interrupted yet again. This time, the nasally sounding voice that grated on his nerves spoke with defiance and hatred. "My sister has been here for over 8 hours, and you're just now strolling in? What kind of husband are you? I'm so happy she's divorcing your sorry ass." Steve raised an eyebrow at this new revelation. "Mary, my favorite in-law." Steve rolled his eyes and shoulder bumped his sister-in-law on the way to his wife's room. All the pain, all the drama, all the anguish that Steve endured did not prepare him for the sight that he witnessed at the threshold of the hospital room. Jill's weakened frame gave her a sickly look. Her complexion lacked color and paled in comparison to the light blue hospital gown. The four inserted into her arm looked like a spaghetti mess, typically seen in his networking closets. Jill was being rebooted. All of the emotion came flooding back. Memories of his first date with his wife, their wedding day, and the honeymoon struck him like a ton of bricks. Memories of all the birthdays, anniversaries, and celebrations took his breath away. He felt his heart drop, though, when he noticed that Jill turned her head away from him. She did not want to see him. Softly, Jill spoke, "Don't look at me, Steve. I don't want you to see me like this." Pain and misery permeated each syllable she uttered. Tears trickled down her pale cheeks. Steve wanted to reach out and wipe away those tears, embrace his loving wife to console her, and tell her that everything would be okay. However, his feet were anchored by the events that transpired the night before. He was being torn, yet again. Steve opened his mouth, trying to find the words to say. He was so certain of the verbal assault he wanted to give his cheating wife, but the image before him stole his thunder. He cared for this woman for the past 20 years. His heart could not bring him to barrage her. "Just leave her alone, Steve," spoke that annoying voice from behind. Mary walked past Steve so that she could claim her place by Jill's bedside. "She doesn't need you anymore." Steve ignored Mary as he looked towards his weakened wife. "I just want to know why, and then I'll be gone." His words stung Jill. Regret and remorse covered her face as she weakly turned back to her husband. Her eyes expressed the sorrow and sadness that consumed her. She lifted her hand in an attempt to grab hold of her husband, even if he stood several feet away from the bed. However, Mary took Jill's hand and patted the back of her hand in a comforting manner. The interruption in Jill's gesture caused her to look away once again in grief. "You want to know why? Because you're in a hole, Steve. That's why. You're never there for her. You care more about your stupid job than you do for her," explained his sister-in-law with venom. She finally found someone that made her feel alive, that made her feel like a woman again. "I'm happy for her. You should just leave her alone so that she can be happy with her new man." Jill turned back to face Steve. It was evident that she did not fully agree with her sister's sentiment. She said in a soft manner, "I did not want you to find out like this. I did not want to hurt you. You could have said something. We could have gone to counseling," said Steve, sounding quite defeated. Time for counseling was long overdue. She found the comfort in the arms of a real man, Steve. "So why don't you just go back to your computers and let her get on with her life?" spat Mary once again. "Mary, stop. Can you give me and Steve a few moments?" Jill pleaded in her weakened state. Mary reluctantly got up from the bedside seat. Her dark eyes bore into Steve, trying to gouge out his eyes and his heart. The temperature of the hospital room went up a degree or two when she finally exited. Jill, once again, reached out for her husband. Steve took a few steps into the room so that they could share some privacy. However, he refused to take her hand. Jill acknowledged the pained expression of her husband and lowered her hand. "Yes, I should have said something to you, but I was so caught up in the whirlwind. I wish I could explain everything to you, Steve." Steve folded his arms and said with little to no emotion, "Instead of wishing, just do it. I can't read your mind, Jill. I'm almost 40 years old. I've lived half of my life. With the boys all grown, there was nothing left for me in the house. I needed something to fill that void. And with you always working and going on business trips, I got lonely." Steve sighed, shaking his head. "You could have said something to me. You could have gone with me on those business trips. I offered countless times to book you a room. We could have even taken the weekend before or the weekend after those trips to have just you and me time." Jill said dejectedly, "I know, Steve. I know. I guess now, I wish I would have taken you up on those offers. She looked up with despair, but I don't think we could have afforded it. We'd be in so much debt. I would much rather go into debt than letting our marriage suffer, countered Steve. Jill closed her eyes. The verbalizing of their dying marriage hurt her. She remained quiet, hoping that when she reopened her eyes, that all of this was some horrible nightmare and it could all be forgotten. Steve's voice interrupted her silent wish. So what about this Chris fellow? Are you in love with him? I don't know. She hoped that her ambiguous answer would appease her husband's curiosity. The stone-cold expression from Steve proved to her that such hope was folly. She continued, He's not you. He pays attention to me. He likes to do things out in the yard. He likes my garden. He shares time with me. He makes me feel like the things I like matter. He compliments me on how I look. He tells me how beautiful I am. He notices when I do my hair. Steve rolled his eyes. Look, Gloria's boy toy is going to say all those things and do all those things because he wants to sleep with you. The horror on Jill's face was priceless for Steve when he mentioned the nickname that Gloria used for Chris. However, Jill got defensive. She mustered up the energy to retort, So are you saying that I'm not beautiful? Steve's shoulders dropped. No, I'm not saying that at all. I think you're gorgeous. I thought I said that enough, but obviously I didn't. Look, I'm sorry if I made you feel neglected or ugly or any of those things. You know I loved you. Everything I did for you and the family. Jill looked away, unable to face her husband. In her heart, she knew his words to be true. Without looking back, she asked, Do you think you can forgive me? Forgive? Yes, Steve sighed, trying to find the energy to continue this conversation. But I cannot forget what you have done to me and our marriage. Though, according to Mary, it sounded like you have already given up on our marriage and have filed for divorce. Jill turned back to Steve. She once again lifted her hand to touch her husband. Her eyes pleaded for understanding. That was Mary's doing. If I could go back in time, I would change everything, Steve. I would. I'm so sorry. Steve shook his head. Shoulda, woulda, coulda, Jill. You can't change the past. When I came home early and found you having sex with Chris on our marital bed, my heart and my love for you died. If I could go back in time, I definitely would not have come home early. But I can't change time, and so now, every time I see you or think of you, I see you with him. Steve ground his teeth. I hear those hateful words that you said. I can't get that out of my head no matter how hard I try. Jill sunk into the hospital's pillow at Steve's revelation. She frowned and tried to convey her sincerest apology. Oh God, no. Steve, no. That was the S talking. Oh please, you have to understand that I didn't mean that. I didn't waste anything with you. Please believe me. I wish I could, Jill. I really do. Steve started to turn back for the door. Jill wanted to jump out of her bed, race over to her husband and cling onto him so that he would not leave. However, the accident prevented her body from doing just that. She clutched onto the railings of the bed and tried to will a miraculous recovery. All she accomplished was the rattling of her foreback. The helpless feeling consumed her, much in the same way that Steve was helpless on that fateful night when he discovered his wife's infidelity. I won't fight the divorce, Jill. The boys are grown. There's enough equity in the house for you to live on. I'll move out and find some apartment somewhere. You can live in happiness with Chris and Gloria and Dan, but I'm going to let you explain to the boys why we're getting divorced. Steve paused at the door of the hospital room. He faced Jill for the last time. Oh, and silly me. I almost forgot. What's the prognosis? What did the doctor say about your injury? Jill tried her best to sound upbeat, though the loss of the husband is hard to hide. He said it was too soon to tell. We should know something in the next couple of days. He did say that it was an incomplete spinal cord injury and that I should regain the use of my legs in time. The silence in the room carried before Jill spoke again. I'll be staying with my sister until the doctor thinks it's all right for me to be on my own. Steve nodded his head and found the willpower to leave the room. Her parting words did nothing to ease his suffering. I'm so sorry, Steve. The town never felt so small until now. What used to feel like home and family had grown cold and uncaring. Buildings that had meaning are just structures made of stone, concrete, and wood. Streets that used to lead somewhere full of excitement now are just concrete pavement that connect the lifeless buildings together. Only the fluorescent sign in front of the small school building had any life as it promoted the 25th reunion of the small town's high school. The parking lot was filled with cars of various makes and models, though none quite as expensive as the BMW Roadster that Steve drove. His walk towards the side entrance of the school reminded him of times when the members of the football team would give him wedgies or knock books out of his arms, but all of that was in the past. Steve cared very little as he stepped over the sacred turf those football bullies claimed as theirs. People inside the small school were dressed as in a variety of fashions, ranging from the casual to the elegant. Steve could easily tell the family's income level by the choice in dress. The blue-collar workers wore jeans and a nice shirt. Mid-managers wore business casual such as khakis, slacks, and a button-down shirt. And then there were those in administration, choosing to also go with business casual but wore a sports coat. They wore enough of a casual look, while still looking dignified and commanded respect. Steve looked around the gathering in an attempt to find his wife. His eyes scoured through the dimly lit room. His gaze fell upon a woman that had curled her brown hair in soft ringlets, but wore it up off the neck. She wore just enough makeup to make herself presentable, but not stand out. The dangling earrings drew attention to the soft lobes of her ears and highlighted the gracefulness of her neck. Seeing her in such regality caused his heart to skip a beat. In that pause, the woman noticed him and started walking towards him with her cane in hand. "Steve, I didn't expect to see you here," she said with a touch of fondness in her voice. Her eyes, though, betrayed her composure. Excitement, hope, and life danced within those eyes. Steve smiled politely. "Well, I didn't expect to be here either. However, sometimes a man's got to do what a man's got to do." He then paused to give a noticeable once-over. "Jill, you look quite lovely this evening. I like what you did with your hair." Jill could not help but blush at the compliment. She raised her hand up to fiddle with a barrette located at the back of her head. "Thank you, Steve. It looks like you've lost some weight." Steve looked down at himself, opening up his sports coat to reveal a trim waistline. "Well, I got tired of carrying that spare tire around my waist." His smile touched his lips, though the merriment did not quite reach his eyes. "So how are you doing, Jill? How's Chris?" Jill looked down to her feet, absorbing the mental blow of the question. She looked back up with a feigned smile and answered, "Chris left town a few months after we got divorced, Steve. No one was hiring an out-of-work forklift operator. He said that he would call when he found a job, but I haven't heard from him." "I'm sorry to hear that, Jill. I really am. I remember the way you said he made you feel. You deserve that in your life." Jill sighed, shaking her head. "Don't patronize me, Steve. Go ahead and gloat. Say it." She mimicked, "I told you so." Steve simply shook his head, holding up his hands. "Honestly, Jill, I have moved on. You said that he made you happy, and I was hoping that you were. I'm sorry that he didn't turn out to be the man you wanted him to be." Jill bit her lip while altering her posture in an attempt to view Steve in a different light. She narrowed her brow, trying to decipher his body language and meaning. She asked, "So how are you?" "I'm doing well. I have been offered a position at St. Mary's Medical as Regional IT Director, with the provision of becoming Chief Information Officer after a year. I never thought I'd finally get a chance to be a CIO, but it's only a matter of time now. What about you? How are things in your life?" Jill smiled with sincerity, knowing Steve's dream had finally come to fruition. "Steve, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you. That's what you always wanted." She then shrugged helplessly. "Me? I work at the local library as their chief librarian. It's not much, but it pays the bills." Steve nodded with his own sense of understanding. "Well, you always did have a thing for books. Now you can share your love of books with the community." Jill clucked her tongue, annoyed but not with Steve. She said dejectedly, "Well, we're moving more towards the digital age, such as books on MP3s or as downloadable media and internet access. We do have some hardback books, but we're getting less and less. As the town continues to cut our budget, we rely more on donations." She wrinkled her nose. "So we mostly get trashy romance novels." Steve could not help but chuckle at the predicament. "I'm sorry, Jill. That sounds horrible. Hopefully, You can get better donations in the future. The word future brought Jill back to the here and now. She could no longer contain her curiosity. Are you here with someone? Or are you by yourself? You would think I was by myself? Steve answered cryptically as he tried to look around the room once more. Jill understood the implied meaning, causing her shoulders to drop. Steve responded in kind. So what about you? Since Chris is no longer in the picture, have you found someone? Jill stammered for a moment, before she finally said, well, Jimmy and I are dating, though I don't think it's serious. He works at the gym now. She shook her head with a slight shrug of her shoulders. I swear he can't keep his eyes to himself. He works at the gym? What happened to him being a police officer? Jill chuckled at the question. Apparently, there was some clerical error and Chris' car got demolished rather than impounded. They blamed Jimmy for the mistake. Jimmy denied any involvement, but he was jealous of Chris. Even now, he wonders if he's better than Chris. Steve raised an eyebrow and questioned his ex-wife. Well, is he? Only one person ever truly rocked my world, Steve. The look on Jill's face revealed the answer to Steve. He was touched by the sentiment. However, it was at that moment that Steve saw who he was looking for since his arrival. He smiled warmly, which Jill mistook for a response to her statement. Jill, I would like for you to meet someone, explained Steve. Steve offered her arm to Jill so that she would not have to use her cane during the short walk. The two of them came upon a circle of women, cackling and giggling like hens in a hen house. One of the women wore a little black dress that hugged her curves rather elegantly. She wore her long red hair with blonde highlights. Her small stature did not seem to faze her air of confidence and radiance. Her back was turned to Steve and Jill. Believe me, girls, I had to come up with the most asinine excuse to push him towards her. It was hard for me to swallow that advice, but I wanted to make sure that he had full closure. I didn't want any doubts to linger. I wanted him for myself, and I wasn't going to share him with a what if, said the redhead. Steve cleared his throat as the other women in the small gathering tried to hide their giggles. Amber turned around and smiled brightly. She wrapped her arms around Steve and placed a kiss upon his lips. She did not even acknowledge Jill until after the embrace. Jill, I would like for you to meet my wife, Amber, Steve said with a hint of pride and love. Jill's heart sank as Steve wrapped his arm around the small of Amber's back, leaving Jill to return to the wooden cane for support. The rest of the evening was uneventful. While Jill was resigned to her fate as being second fiddle, she played up the role as a supporting friend to Steve and his blushing bride, Amber. Conversations bounced from one topic to another. By the end of the night, Steve learned that Dan Hart had to file for bankruptcy after he lost most of his customers due to a systems malfunction which caused his shipments to be late. While he managed to maintain a small client base, it was not enough to support the fleet. When he filed for bankruptcy, any remnants of wealth he had left belonged to Gloria after the divorce settlement. It was also discovered that Jonathan, the former CFO of the hospital, was fired. Steve never shared the fact that he was almost fired, himself, for violating HIPAA regulations. When Jonathan confronted Steve about the violations, Steve threatened a lawsuit of sexual harassment. Jonathan cowered and catered to Steve's demands of a severance package that included a base settlement, twice his salary in exchange for Steve's silence. Jonathan's womanizing ways, though, caught up with him and karma proved the victor.